A flight attendant insults his mother. This little boy shuts down the entire plane. Act 1. The year is 2019. Flight 447 from Atlanta to Los Angeles is about to push back from a gate. You can hear it, the low, steady hum of the engines warming up beneath the cabin floor. That familiar smell of recycled air and plastic seats. The muffled sound of rolling luggage being shoved into overhead compartments. People finding their rows. Seat belts clicking. Phones going on to airplane mode. Ordinary. Routine. Just another Tuesday morning flight. But somewhere near the front of that cabin, something is happening that nobody on that plane is going to forget for the rest of their lives. There is a woman in seat 4B. Her name is Dorothy Mae Williams. She is 71 years old. She is small. She is quiet. Her silver hair is neatly pinned back. She's wearing a floral blouse she's had for 15 years because she never cared much for new things. In her lap sits a worn leather handbag, the kind that tells you it has been carried through decades of hard mornings and long evenings. Dorothy Mae is not a woman who asks for much. She never was. She raised 3 children on her own. She worked double shifts. She made things work when things had no business working. And today, all she wants to do is get on this plane, get to Los Angeles, and see her youngest son who she hasn't visited in 8 months. That's all she wants. But the man in the blue uniform, the flight attendant walking that aisle, he has other ideas. His name is Brandon Caldwell, 34 years old. He's worked this route dozens of times. He knows the job. He knows the script. But today, for reasons no one will fully understand until much later, Brandon Caldwell is in no mood for patience. He stops next to Dorothy Mae's row. His voice carries just enough, loud enough for the people around her to hear, too quiet for it to feel like a real scene. He says something to her, something about her seat, something that makes her pause and look up at him with those tired, dignified eyes. And the people around her hear it. They look over. They feel something tighten in the air. But nobody says a word. Nobody stands up. They go back to their phones, their magazines, their little cups of water. That is what happens when people witness something wrong in a public place. They look. They feel uncomfortable. And then they decide it's not their fight. But not everyone on that plane made that decision. 3 rows back, in seat 7C, a small boy named Caleb Webb is watching every single second of it. He's 9 years old. He's got a little notebook in his lap that he uses to draw things. He drew a cloud earlier. He drew the wing of the plane. Now he's not drawing anything. He's watching. And something is rising inside that little boy. Something that doesn't yet have a name in his vocabulary, but that every adult in that cabin has felt before and chosen to swallow down. Caleb doesn't swallow it down. He closes his notebook. He straightens up in his seat, and he does something that will make the entire cabin go absolutely silent. What happens next forced the entire plane to stop mid-flight. It forced an airline to launch a full investigation. It moved grown men to tears. And the woman at the center of it all, Dorothy Mae Williams, was not who anyone thought she was. Stay with me, because this story goes deeper than you can imagine. If stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button right now. We tell real human stories every single week, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. Engagement question. Before we go any further, have you ever witnessed someone being disrespected in public and stayed silent? Drop your honest answer in the comments. No judgment. Let's talk about it. Act 2. To understand what happened on that flight, you have to understand who these people were before they ever stepped foot on that plane. Let's start with Dorothy Mae Williams. Dorothy Mae was born in 1948 in Selma, Alabama, the third of 7 children. Her father worked in a steel mill. Her mother cleaned houses for white families on the north side of town. They were not poor in the way that breaks people. They were poor in the way that teaches people. There's a difference. Dorothy Mae learned early how to carry herself with dignity in a world that didn't always offer her any. She learned how to walk into rooms where she wasn't wanted and hold her spine straight. She learned how to smile at people who looked through her, not because she was weak, but because she understood something those people never did, that grace costs you nothing and it could disarm anyone. She moved to Atlanta in 1971 with $12 and a suitcase. Got a job as a nurse's aide at Grady Memorial Hospital. Worked there for 31 years. 31 years of 12-hour shifts. 31 years of caring for people at their most desperate, most frightened, most broken moments. She held hands. She prayed over people. She cleaned wounds. She called families in the middle of the night. She was not the doctor. She was not the surgeon. But in the words of people who knew her, she was often the most important person in that building. She married once. His name was Robert Williams. Good man. Quiet man. Loved her like the sun. He died of a heart attack in 1994, and Dorothy Mae Williams raised the rest of her 3 children alone. Caleb, her youngest, he was just 4 years old when Robert died. So Dorothy Mae worked. She worked, and she prayed, and she loved those children with everything she had. She sent all 3 of them to college, put every dollar she had into their futures. When Caleb got his job in Los Angeles, a good job, a real job, she cried for an hour in her kitchen and then packed him the biggest box of food you've ever seen. That woman had earned every quiet moment in her life. Now let's talk about Caleb Alexander Webb. Not Dorothy's son Caleb, different Caleb. This is the 9-year-old boy in seat 7C. Caleb Webb was born in Atlanta, Georgia in 2010. His father's name is James Webb, a tall, calm, thoughtful man who worked as a high school history teacher. His mother passed away from cancer when Caleb was 6. Just like Dorothy Mae, James Webb raised his child alone. Just like Dorothy Mae, he raised that child to be present, to be aware, to care about other people. James Webb used to tell his son, Caleb, the measure of a person isn't what they do when everyone's watching. It's what they do when no one thinks it matters. Caleb had heard that so many times it had become part of how he thought. He was 9, but he processed the world like someone who had been taught to notice things. He noticed when his teacher was tired. He noticed when kids at school were being left out. He noticed when something wasn't right. He had a notebook he carried everywhere, a red spiral notebook, slightly bent at the corners. He drew in it. He wrote words in it sometimes. Not sentences, just words that came to him. Words like unfair. Words like why. Words like somebody should say something. He was sitting in 7C next to his father, who had the window seat. They were flying to Los Angeles to visit his grandmother, his father's mother, who lived in Inglewood. Caleb had been excited for weeks about the trip. He had the notebook open in his lap. He was drawing the clouds when he first noticed the woman in 4B. She smiled at him during boarding. Just a small, warm smile. The kind that grandmothers give to children they've never met, but somehow already know. Caleb smiled back. His father noticed and nodded approvingly. He didn't think much of it then. He went back to drawing. But he kept noticing her. The way she sat so carefully. The way she folded her hands. The way she looked out the window, like she was already thinking about someone she loved. And then there was Brandon Caldwell. Brandon Caldwell had been a flight attendant for 8 years. He was not a bad person in the way that some people are born bad. He was the kind of person who had made enough small choices in the wrong direction that he'd lost track of who he was supposed to be. He was used to getting his way. He was used to passengers deferring to him in the cabin, because that's how it worked. That was the dynamic, and Brandon had gotten comfortable with that dynamic in a way that was not entirely healthy. He was stressed that morning. He'd been working a double. He'd had an argument with his supervisor. His lower back hurt. He was tired. None of that is an excuse, but it is a context. Because what Brandon Caldwell did that morning wasn't born out of hatred. It was born out of something smaller and in some ways worse. Carelessness. The kind of carelessness that happens when you stop seeing other people as fully human because you're too caught up in your own bad morning. He saw Dorothy Mae as an inconvenience, as a slow, elderly woman taking up his time. He couldn't have been more wrong about who she was. If you're new here, subscribe right now. We're just getting started, and this story is about to go somewhere you're not expecting. Engagement question. Think about Dorothy Mae, 31 years caring for people, raising 3 kids alone, never asking for much. Do you know someone like her in your life? Tell us about them in the comments. Let's honor people like that. Act 3. At 9:14 in the morning, Flight 447 pushed back from Gate C-22 at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. The sky was that particular shade of blue you only get in Georgia in October. Deep and clean, the kind of sky that makes you feel like good things are possible. There were a few white clouds scattered low on the horizon, but the forecast was clear. Smooth flying all the way to LAX. The flight was about 85% full. 147 passengers. Most of them were business travelers, people with laptops already open, earbuds already in, eyes already glazed over with the practiced indifference of frequent flyers. A few families. A group of college students in the back who were already too loud. Two elderly couples traveling together who were debating where to eat lunch in Los Angeles. Normal. Ordinary. Unremarkable. The takeoff was smooth. The plane banked west over Georgia and settled into its cruising altitude, and the captain came on to do his welcome aboard speech in that reassuring, slightly bored voice that all captains seem to have. His name was Captain Richard Holt, 22 years of flying, 15,000 hours in the air. He had flown every kind of weather and every kind of passenger. He knew how to handle things when they got complicated. He didn't know yet that today was going to be one of those days. Back in the cabin, the seat belt sign clicked off, and people began to breathe a little easier. A few folks got up to use the bathroom. The cabin crew began their service routine, rolling out the cart, handing out drinks, doing the small acts of maintenance that make air travel function. Brandon Caldwell was working the front section of the plane that morning. He went through his routine efficiently. Business travelers in suits who barely looked up. An older gentleman who wanted extra ice. A young woman who asked for a blanket. He was fine in those first few minutes. Professional. Practiced. 3 rows back in coach, Caleb Webb had his tray table down and the red notebook open. He was drawing the Atlanta skyline from memory, or his version of it. Anyway, the version that a 9-year-old who'd grown up around those buildings would draw. Tall rectangles with squares for windows. A little sun in the corner. His father James had the window seat and was reading. He always brought a book on flights. That day, it was a history of the civil rights movement. A thick, dog-eared paperback that he'd read twice already, but kept returning to. They were comfortable, easy. Father and son in the particular silence that doesn't need to be filled. Caleb looked up at one point and noticed the woman from earlier, the one who'd smiled at him. Dorothy Mae. She was 3 rows ahead of him, and he could see the back of her silver hair, the careful way she sat. She was looking out the window, her worn handbag placed carefully under the seat in front of her. At some point during that first peaceful stretch of the flight, Dorothy Mae caught Caleb looking. She turned slightly. Their eyes met across the rows. She smiled again. Small. Warm. Caleb smiled back. His father looked up from his book, noticed the exchange, and went back to reading with a quiet smile of his own. Caleb went back to drawing. It was a small moment. The kind of moment that happens 100 times a day on 100 different flights and means nothing. Except that sometimes small moments are the ones that hold everything else together. A little later, maybe 20 minutes into the flight, Dorothy Mae reached into that worn leather handbag and pulled out a small Ziploc bag of butterscotch candies. She'd had them in there for the flight. She turned around, caught Caleb's eye again, and with the naturalness of someone who'd been offering candies to children for decades, she held one up, glancing at his father for permission. James Webb looked at the candy, looked at the woman, and nodded. Dorothy Mae passed it back to Caleb, a small, warm butterscotch wrapped in gold foil. Caleb took it carefully. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome, baby," Dorothy Mae said quietly. And then she turned back around. Caleb unwrapped it slowly and put it in his mouth. It was sweet. He went back to drawing. Everything was still fine. Everything was still ordinary. But Brandon Caldwell was making his way back up the aisle, and his jaw was tight. In the morning, it continued to go wrong in small ways, and he was about to take that frustration somewhere it had absolutely no business going. Subscribe to Andrew's Black Stories if you want stories that remind you who matters in this world. Hit the bell so you never miss one. Engagement question. That small moment. The candy, the smile between a grandmother and a stranger's child. Why do you think moments like that matter so much? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Act 4. It started with something small. It almost always does. Dorothy Mae's tray table was slightly sticky. One of those things you notice on older planes, the residue of 1,000 previous passengers, the cleaning that didn't quite get everything. She had asked, very politely, if someone could bring her a wet napkin to wipe it down. She'd pressed the call button once. Just once. and waited. Brandon came over. He brought the napkin, but the way he handed it to her, that was the first thing. He held it out without looking at her, the way you might hand something to someone you consider beneath your attention. Dorothy Mae took it and said thank you. Brandon was already turning away. Then he noticed her seat. Dorothy may have been assigned seat 4B, an aisle seat near the front of the coach section. Good seat. She'd picked it because it was easier for her to get up and move around with her arthritis. But somehow, whether it was a boarding pass error or a system glitch or simply a mix-up that could have been corrected in 30 seconds, the seat showed a different passenger assignment on Brandon's handheld device. The other passenger, it turned out, had not actually boarded the flight. The seat was not in dispute. The whole thing was nothing. A non-issue. The kind of thing you resolve with 2 sentences and a professional smile. Brandon Caldwell did not resolve it with 2 sentences and a professional smile. He leaned over and said, not quietly, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to show me your boarding pass." Dorothy Mae looked up. She was calm. She had no idea anything was wrong. "Of course," she said. She began to reach for her handbag. Now, finding things in a handbag takes a moment, especially when you're 71 years old and the bag has a number of pockets and compartments and you're not expecting to be asked for something mid-flight. It takes a moment. Brandon Caldwell did not give her a moment. "Ma'am, if you could hurry up, please. I have other passengers to attend to." The people around Dorothy Mae heard that. The woman in 4A, a businesswoman in her 40s named Patricia, looked up from her laptop. The man in 4C, a retired teacher named Gerald, shifted in his seat. Dorothy Mae didn't react to the tone. She kept her composure. She found her boarding pass, a paper one, printed at the counter, creased neatly in half, and handed it up to him. Brandon looked at it, checked his device. There was the confusion. He looked at her, then at the paper, then at the device. The thing is, any reasonable person would have seen, in about 5 seconds, that the discrepancy was a system error, that the other passenger wasn't on the plane, that this woman was in her assigned seat, exactly where she was supposed to be. Brandon Caldwell's issue was not logical. It was about something else entirely, something he probably couldn't even name. Because instead of saying, "I'm so sorry, ma'am, everything looks fine," he said, "Going forward, it would be helpful if you could have your documents ready before you're asked." Dorothy Mae looked at him for a long moment. "I had them put away," she said simply. "I wasn't expecting to need them in the air." "Well," Brandon said, already turning, "it's just easier for everyone." He walked away. The woman in 4A, Patricia, glanced at Dorothy Mae. Dorothy Mae shook her head slightly, not in anger, but in that particular way that certain people have when something is rude, but they've decided it's not worth the energy. She folded her boarding pass back along its crease and tucked it into her bag. 3 rows back, Caleb Webb had stopped drawing. He'd heard most of that, not all of it. The noise of the cabin swallowed some words. But he'd heard the tone. He'd seen Brandon lean over her. He'd seen the way Dorothy Mae's shoulders had tightened for just a moment, and then released. He didn't say anything. His father hadn't looked up from his book. But Caleb put his pencil down, and he watched. You're rewatching Andrew's Black Stories. Subscribe now and tap the bell. Stories like this one are why we're here. Engagement question. Brandon's behavior started with something small. Impatience, condescension. Have you ever been on the receiving end of that kind of treatment from someone in a position of authority? Tell us in the comments. Act 5. 30 minutes into the flight, the service cart came through. Brandon was working it with another flight attendant, a younger woman named Carla, who'd been with the airline for about a year. Carla was warm, attentive, the kind of person who remembered what you asked for. She was good at the job because she actually cared about doing it well. The cart made its way through the rows. Dorothy Mae waited her turn. When it reached her, she looked up and smiled at Brandon. "Could I have a cup of hot tea, please? Just plain black tea if you have it." Brandon was already reaching for something else. "We don't have tea service right now," he said without looking at her. "We're doing beverages. Coffee or juice." Dorothy Mae nodded. "Then coffee would be fine. Just black." He poured it, set it on her tray without a word. It was a small rudeness. The kind that doesn't leave a mark you can point to, but leaves a mark nonetheless. Carla, standing beside him, noticed. She glanced at Dorothy Mae and gave her a small, apologetic look, the kind that says, "I see that, and I'm sorry, and I'm not sure what to do about it." Dorothy Mae smiled at Carla. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, even though Carla hadn't done anything yet. Just because Dorothy Mae was that kind of person. About 40 minutes into the flight, the turbulence started. Nothing dramatic, a few bumps and rolls, the kind that make you grip your armrest for a second and then let go. The seatbelt sign came back on with a ding. Dorothy Mae's coffee, which had been sitting on her tray table, shifted and nearly tipped. She caught it, but in catching it she jostled the tray table slightly. The tray table, the same slightly finicky one she'd noticed earlier, clicked out of position and angled down just a bit. Dorothy Mae pressed the call button, just to let someone know, just to ask for help fixing it before the coffee actually did spill. It took a few minutes. Brandon arrived. He looked at the tray table. He looked at her. Something flickered across his face, something that wasn't quite annoyance, but wasn't patience either. He reached over and pushed the tray table back into place with more force than was necessary. The coffee sloshed. A little spilled onto the tray. "You'll want to be more careful," Brandon said. Dorothy Mae looked at the spilled coffee, then at him. "I pressed the call button because I needed assistance," she said. Her voice was steady. "The tray table came loose during the turbulence." "Right," Brandon said. "I'll send someone with napkins." And he was already walking away. Gerald, the retired teacher in 4C, leaned over slightly. "You all right?" he asked Dorothy Mae quietly. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm perfectly fine." But Gerald's eyes followed Brandon down the aisle with the look of a man who has spent 30 years teaching teenagers and knows exactly what certain kinds of behavior really are. 2 rows ahead of Caleb, James Webb was still reading his book. But at some point in the last 20 minutes, he'd put it down. He was watching his son, who was watching the front of the cabin with an expression that James had learned to pay attention to. It was the look Caleb got when he was working something out, when something was bothering him, and he was deciding what to do about it. "Hey," James said quietly. "You okay?" Caleb looked at him. "Did you see how he talks to her?" James glanced toward the front. He'd caught pieces of it. He made the same calculation that most adults on that plane had made. "Not my business, not the place, not worth the conflict." "I see it," James said. "Then why doesn't anyone say something?" James Webb was quiet for a moment. He was a history teacher. He knew better than most people what the cost of silence had been in this country, in this very kind of moment, with this very kind of person on the receiving end of it. He knew it in his bones. But he also knew the complications, the way these things can spiral, the way a black man standing up on an airplane can become something other than justice very quickly. "Stay in your seat," he said. Not harshly, just carefully. The way a father says something when he's not fully certain it's the right thing to say. Caleb looked at his father for a long second. Then he looked back at the front of the cabin. He didn't say anything. He picked up his pencil, but he didn't draw. The butterscotch candy wrapper was still on his tray table. Gold foil, slightly crumpled. He looked at it, and something in that small, kind gesture, a stranger's candy, a stranger's warm smile, settled something inside him. Don't leave this video without subscribing. The best part of this story is still coming, and you do not want to miss it. Hit subscribe now. Engagement question. James Webb told his son to stay in his seat, and he wasn't wrong to be careful. But was he right? What would you have done if you were Caleb's father on that flight? Comment below. This is a real conversation worth having. Act 6. 50 minutes into Flight 447. Something happened that changed the entire day. The overhead bin above Dorothy Mae's row had been slightly overpacked during boarding. It happened, not unusual. And now, with the flight in progress, one of the bags up there had shifted. The bin door wasn't fully latched. It was a safety issue, a minor one, but one that needed to be addressed. Brandon noticed it as he came through. The bag that had shifted belonged to another passenger, a businessman 2 rows back who'd put a rolling carry-on in the nearest available space, which happened to be above 4B. Not Dorothy Mae's bag. Hers was under the seat in front of her, exactly where she'd placed it. But Brandon looked at the open bin, looked at the row beneath it, looked at Dorothy Mae, and he said, loud enough that 6 or 7 people heard it clearly, "Ma'am, I've already had to address your seating situation once this flight. Did you move things around up here?" A pause descended on that section of the cabin. Dorothy Mae looked up at him slowly. "I haven't touched the overhead bin," she said. "My bag is under the seat." "Someone moved something up there," Brandon said, his voice carrying a tone that implied he knew exactly who. "It wasn't me. It was a beat." Brandon glanced around the row in that performative way people do when they want to signal that they don't quite believe what they're hearing. Patricia in 4A had fully closed her laptop now. Gerald in 4C had put his magazine down. The businessman 2 rows back. The one whose bag had actually shifted was sitting very still, apparently deciding that this was not the moment to insert himself. Then Brandon said it. He said, "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a premium boarding section. If you're not familiar with how to navigate this part of the aircraft, it might be worth calling ahead next time so we can assist you properly." The silence that followed was total. The implication, the layered, weaponized implication of those words, landed exactly the way they were meant to land. People like you. People who don't belong here. People who should know their place. Dorothy Mae Williams sat very still. Her hands, folded in her lap, pressed together just slightly. Her jaw tightened for just a moment. And then she did something remarkable. She released it. She let the tightness go. She looked out the window. Patricia said, barely above a whisper, "That was not okay." Gerald said a little louder, "Her bag isn't even up there." But Brandon was already moving, adjusting the bin, closing it, walking away with the practiced efficiency of someone who has decided the matter is concluded. Dorothy Mae said nothing. She sat with her hands folded and looked out the window at the clouds below and breathed. Her eyes, just for a moment, glistened. She did not cry. Dorothy Mae Williams had been through too much in 71 years to cry in front of strangers on an airplane over something like this. She'd cried over her husband's grave. She'd cried in the parking lot of a hospital after a 12-hour shift when a patient she'd grown attached to didn't make it. She cried in her kitchen at 2 in the morning after calling her children to say goodnight. She had earned her tears, and she was not going to spend them here. But the glistening was there, and Caleb saw it. He had been watching the whole thing. Every word, every glance, every second of it. And when he saw those eyes, something in him that had been building for 50 minutes finally broke open. He set down his pencil. He closed the red notebook. He looked at his father. James was already looking at him, and the expression on his face was complicated. It was the expression of a man who knows something is about to happen and is not sure whether to stop it or let it go. He didn't stop it. Caleb unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood up. Subscribe to Andrew's Black Stories right now. This is the moment. This is why we tell these stories. Stay with us. Engagement question. Brandon's words didn't technically say it, but everyone in that cabin heard exactly what they meant. Have you ever heard words used as weapons like that? Tell us in the comments. Act 7. A 9-year-old boy standing up in the aisle of a commercial airplane is not, on its own, an unusual sight. But something about the way Caleb Webb stood, the deliberateness of it, the stillness, made the people nearby notice. Not with alarm, with attention. He stood in the aisle next to row 7. He was small, about 4 feet tall, dressed in a navy blue hoodie and jeans, his red notebook still tucked under his arm. He had the kind of face that children have when they've been raised well. Open, attentive, unguarded in the right ways. He said in a clear, steady voice, "Excuse me." Not shouted, not trembling, just said, the way you'd say it to get a teacher's attention. Brandon Caldwell, who had been moving toward the rear of the cabin, stopped. He turned. He looked at the child standing in the aisle, and he made the first in a series of mistakes that would define the next 20 minutes of his life. He smiled, the tolerant, condescending smile of an adult who has decided a child is not worth real engagement. "Hey there, buddy," he said. "You need to sit back down. Seat belt signs on." "I know," Caleb said. "I just have a question." "Okay, ask your dad your question and sit down." "It's not for my dad," Caleb said. "It's for you." Something shifted in the air. The people who had been watching began to watch more carefully. Brandon walked back up the aisle toward Caleb, clearly intending to usher him back in his seat with some gentle but firm redirection, the way you handle a child who's wandered somewhere he shouldn't be. He crouched down slightly to meet Caleb's eye level. "What's your question, buddy?" Caleb looked at him, direct, unblinking, and he said, "Why do you talk to her like that?" Brandon blinked. "Excuse me? That lady?" Caleb pointed toward Dorothy Mae's row, the one with the silver hair. "You've talked to her 3 times on this flight, and every time you talked to her like she did something wrong. She didn't do anything wrong. I've been watching." The silence on that section of the plane was now complete. Not the comfortable silence of people minding their own business. The electric silence of people who have stopped breathing. Brandon's jaw tightened. He straightened up. He was no longer smiling. "That's really not your concern," he said. "Now I need you to sit down." "It is my concern," Caleb said, "because she was nice to me. She gave me a candy. And she said thank you to everybody even when nobody was nice back to her. And she's just sitting there and you keep saying things that aren't fair." Patricia, in 4A, had turned around fully in her seat. Gerald was watching over his headrest. James Webb, in row 7, had put his book all the way down and was watching his son with an expression that no longer had any conflict in it. Brandon said, lower now, "Son, I understand you're upset, but this is not something a 9-year-old needs to get involved in. Please sit down." "I'm not 9, Caleb said. "I'm 9.5. Somewhere in the cabin, someone laughed. A short, helpless laugh. And then Caleb said something that nobody in that cabin was prepared for. He turned to Dorothy Mae, who had heard everything, who had turned slowly in her seat to look at this small boy standing in the aisle on her behalf. And he said, "My dad told me that the measure of a person isn't what they do when everybody's watching. It's what they do when no one thinks it matters." He looked back at Brandon. "People are watching now." Dorothy Mae Williams pressed her hand to her mouth. She recognized something in that sentence. Not the exact words, but the shape of the thought, the philosophy underneath it, the kind of thing that gets passed down through generations of people who have had to fight to be seen. She recognized it the way you recognize a song you haven't heard since childhood, in your bones before your brain catches up. She looked at this small boy, this stranger's child, standing in an airplane aisle with his little notebook under his arm and his navy hoodie and his complete, unashamed conviction. And for the first time that flight, something broke open in Dorothy Mae Williams. Not grief, not anger, but something warmer than both. Brandon Caldwell was very quiet now. The cabin was very quiet now. And Caleb Webb stood where he was, steady, waiting. This channel exists for moments exactly like this one. Subscribe to Andrew's Black Stories and be part of a community that believes these stories matter. Engagement question. Caleb was 9 years old, and he said what a whole cabin full of adults wouldn't say. What do you think holds adults back from speaking up in moments like that? Be honest. Drop your answer in the comments. Act 8. What happened next was not something Brandon Caldwell initiated. It came from a woman in row 9. Her name was Dr. Evelyn Carter, a 58-year-old physician from Houston, Texas, who had been listening to all of this from behind her medical journal. She had gray-streaked locks, reading glasses on the end of her nose, and the bearing of someone who has been in too many real emergencies to lose her composure over manufactured ones. She lowered her journal. She took off her glasses. She looked at the back of Dorothy Mae's silver head, and she said, quietly but carrying, "Is that Dorothy Williams? From Grady Memorial?" Dorothy Mae turned. She looked at the woman. Something crossed her face, recognition, soft and surprised. "Evelyn," she said. "Evelyn Carter?" Dr. Carter stood up from her seat and walked to the aisle, standing alongside Caleb, who was still there, still steady. "Lord, it's been, 12 years?" Dr. Carter said. "At least," Dorothy Mae said. Brandon was standing there watching this, a look on his face that people who have committed a serious mistake get when they first begin to understand the scope of it. Dr. Carter turned to the cabin, not performing, not making a speech, just stating a fact with the directness of a person who has no patience for pretense. "I want to make sure everyone on this flight knows who they're sitting next to," she said. This woman, Dorothy Mae Williams, spent 31 years as a nurse at Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta. In 1998, there was a multi-car accident on I-285. 17 people injured, 4 of them critical. This woman worked for 36 hours straight without going home. She helped save the lives of 4 people that night. One of them was my husband. Nobody moved. Dr. Carter wasn't finished. In 2003, there was a fire in an apartment complex in southwest Atlanta. 11 families displaced overnight. Dorothy Mae showed up the next morning with her church group, blankets, food, and enough personal donations to cover the first month's temporary housing for 3 of those families. She didn't tell anyone about it. I only found out because a nurse on my floor happened to be one of those families. She paused. In 2007, Dorothy Mae founded the Williams Nursing Scholarship, named after her late husband Robert. To date, that scholarship has sent 43 young black women and men through nursing school who couldn't afford it otherwise. 43 nurses now working in hospitals across this country. Because of her, because of what she built on a hospital aide salary. The businessman, too, rose back. The one whose bag had started this whole thing. The one who had stayed very quiet. Put his face in his hands. Patricia in 4A was crying. Gerald in 4C sat perfectly still with his hand over his heart. Dorothy Mae was looking at Dr. Carter with an expression that mixed gratitude and embarrassment. The expression of a truly humble person who has been seen publicly and doesn't quite know what to do with it. "Evelyn," she said softly, "you don't have to." "Yes, I do," Dr. Carter said simply. "Yes, I do." She looked at Brandon Caldwell. She didn't say anything else to him. She didn't have to. The look was sufficient. Brandon Caldwell stood very still in the aisle of Flight 447 and understood, with the full weight of what understanding costs, exactly what he had done. He had not just been rude to an elderly passenger. He had looked at a woman who had dedicated her life to other people's survival and seen nothing. He had looked at 31 years of night shifts and sacrifice and grace and seen an inconvenience. He had looked at a scholarship and a church group and 36 hours standing over patients in crisis and decided she didn't know how to navigate a boarding section. He had looked at Dorothy Mae Williams and seen less than she was. There's a particular kind of shame that comes not from being caught doing wrong, but from understanding, truly understanding, the full distance between what you did and what was deserved. It is a heavy thing. It is the kind of shame that, if you let it, can actually change you. Brandon Caldwell stood there and held it. And Caleb Webb, still standing in the aisle with his red notebook under his arm, looked at the flight attendant with not anger and not triumph, but something quieter than both. He looked at him with the particular patience of a child who's been raised to believe that people can do. Subscribe to Andrew's Black Stories and share this video with someone who needs to hear this story today. It matters. Engagement question. Dorothy Mae never told anyone about what she built. She just did it. The scholarship, the donations, all of it. No fanfare. Do you think we do enough to honor the quiet heroes in our communities? Tell us in the comments. Act 9. What happened in the next several minutes was not orchestrated. It was not planned. It was what happens when a group of strangers who have been sitting in uncomfortable silence finally decide that the silence is no longer acceptable. It started with Carla, the other flight attendant, the younger one, the one who had given Dorothy Mae an apologetic look over the spilled coffee, walked up the aisle and stood beside Dorothy Mae's row. "Mrs. Williams," she said, "I am so sorry. Please let me know if there is absolutely anything I can do for you for the rest of this flight." Dorothy Mae looked at her and smiled. "You're very kind," she said. "I'm all right." "No," Carla said, "steady, I mean it. Whatever you need." Then Gerald in 4C turned to Brandon, who was standing there still processing the full weight of what had just been said. Gerald was 67 years old, a retired history teacher from Birmingham, Alabama. He had the quiet, certain authority of a man who has spent decades saying things that matter to young people who didn't always want to hear them. "Son," Gerald said, and somehow the word son carried everything it needed to carry. "You owe this woman an apology. A real one. Right now." There was a beat. The whole cabin was listening. Patricia in 4A said, "I'd like to speak with your supervisor when we land." The businessman, too, rose back. Finally, belatedly, too late, but still. "That was my bag in the overhead. Not hers. I should have said that immediately. I'm sorry I didn't." A woman from further back in the cabin called out, "Can we get the captain involved, please? I like this on record." And then James Webb, who had been sitting in row 7 watching his son stand in that aisle for the last 10 minutes, stood up himself. He was tall, 6'2", and when he rose there was a calm, serious gravity to it. He looked at Brandon and said, simply, "My son showed you something today. I hope you'll carry it." Brandon looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at his father, and something passed between them, something that didn't need words. Up at the front of the plane, a small intercom light clicked on as Carla had, in fact, quietly called the cockpit to inform Captain Holt of what was happening in the cabin. Standard protocol when the cabin environment becomes disturbed. The captain had been listening to a brief summary for the last 3 minutes. The intercom clicked. Captain Holt's voice came through, steady and measured, but carrying the weight of an announcement. "Folks, this is your captain. I want to acknowledge that there appears to have been an incident involving the treatment of a passenger in the main cabin. I take that seriously. My crew has been informed. We will be conducting a full debrief upon arrival at LAX, and the relevant parties will be noted in our report. I want every passenger on this flight to know this airline does not tolerate the disrespectful treatment of any passenger. Period." And then, after a pause, "Mrs. Williams, if you're listening, on behalf of this crew, I am sorry." The cabin was completely silent for 3 seconds, and then it erupted, not in chaos, but in applause. Real, warm, spontaneous applause. The kind that happens when people who have been holding something in finally get to let it out. The college students in the back, the elderly couples near the window, Patricia and Gerald, and the businessman who sat with his head bowed. People who'd been on their phones the whole flight looked up and clapped. Dorothy Mae Williams sat in seat 4B and pressed her hands together in her lap and closed her eyes. She was thinking at that moment about Robert, about what he would have said. He would have squeezed her hand and said, "There you go, Dorothy," in that quiet, certain way of his. She was sure of it. Brandon Caldwell walked forward to Dorothy Mae's row. He stood there for a moment. He was not performing now. His face had let go of everything it had been holding. He looked like someone who had just been told the truth about himself and was deciding whether to accept it. He said, "Mrs. Williams, I owe you an apology. What I said, the way I treated you was wrong. It was disrespectful, and you did not deserve any of it. I'm sorry, genuinely." Dorothy Mae looked at him, a long, quiet, considering look, and then she nodded. Not forgiveness, necessarily. That's a personal thing, and it takes time, and it's not owed in the moment. But an acknowledgement, a recognition that the apology was real. "Thank you," she said. Brandon nodded. He stepped back. He went to the rear of the cabin. Caleb, who had finally sat back down, his father's hand on his shoulder, a proud, quiet, complicated grip, looked at the gold candy wrapper on his tray table. He picked it up, smoothed it out carefully, put it in his red notebook between 2 pages. Subscribe to Andrew's Black Stories. This is the kind of storytelling we live for. Hit that button right now and join our community. Engagement question. Captain Holt apologized publicly over the intercom. Do you think that was the right call? What would you have done if you were the captain of that flight? We really want to know. Comment below. Act 10. Flight 447 landed at LAX at 11:47 in the morning Pacific time. On time. Smooth landing. The passengers began to gather their things. The practice choreography of arrival. Overhead bins opening, phones buzzing back to life. The collective exhale of people returning to their regular lives. But there was something different about how people moved in those last few minutes. A little slower. A little more present. Dr. Evelyn Carter touched Dorothy Mae on the shoulder before she stood. "You call me," she said. "We have 12 years of catching up to do." She handed her a card. Dorothy Mae took it and held it like it was something precious. Patricia, in 4A, turned around fully to face her. She was still red-eyed. "I should have said something earlier," she said. "I heard it, and I didn't say anything, and I should have. I'm sorry for that." Dorothy Mae shook her head gently. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Patricia said. "I want to, because it mattered." Gerald in 4C stood and offered Dorothy Mae his hand to help her up, and she took it, thanked him, straightened her floral blouse, and picked up her worn leather handbag. As the aisle cleared and people filed toward the door, Caleb and his father made their way forward. They were passing row 4 when Dorothy Mae stepped into the aisle and turned around. She looked at Caleb. He looked at her. "What's your name, baby?" she asked. "Caleb," he said. "Caleb Webb." Dorothy Mae looked at him for a long, full moment. The way she had looked at patients in a hospital who needed to be truly seen. The way she had looked at her own children when she needed them to hear something that mattered. "Caleb Webb," she said, "you did something today that a lot of grown people didn't do. You stood up, not because someone told you to, not because it was easy, because it was right." She reached out and put her hand gently on the side of his face, the way grandmothers do, that particular gesture that has no name but means everything. "Never stop doing that," she said. "The world needs people who stand up when no one expects them to. Don't you ever let that go. You hear me?" Caleb nodded. His voice, for the first time in the whole story, was small. "Yes, ma'am." Dorothy Mae smiled. The full smile, the one she hadn't used all flight. The one that must have lit up hospital rooms for 31 years. She looked at James Webb. "You raised a good one," she said. James Webb pressed his lips together. He nodded. "He's better than me most days," he said quietly. Dorothy Mae laughed, a warm, real laugh that surprised people nearby and made them smile without knowing why. She gave Caleb one last look, a look that meant something, that meant, "I see you and I will remember you." And then she turned and walked off that plane. She walked through the jetway and out into the terminal, and she kept walking, steady and unhurried, through the noise and the crowds and the bright California light coming through the airport windows. She had a son to get to, a youngest child who hadn't seen her in 8 months, probably waiting for her right outside baggage claim, probably too tall now, probably with that look on his face he always got when he was trying to play it cool, but couldn't quite manage it. She had things to do, people to love. Behind her, on that plane, Caleb Webb opened his red notebook to the page with the gold candy wrapper. He looked at it for a second. Then he picked up his pencil. He wrote, "Stand up." Just those 2 words. 2 words that, if you live by them, really live by them, not just say them, but feel them in your body and act on them, even when your father says stay in your seat and you stand up anyway, can change something. Not just a flight, something bigger. Because here is what I want you to carry when you leave this story. Brandon Caldwell was placed on administrative leave following the flight. He completed a mandatory sensitivity training program and, according to people who know him, spent a significant amount of time doing something that doesn't come naturally to most of us, genuinely reckoning with himself. Whether he became a better person is between him and the choices he makes every day. That's always how it works. The Williams Nursing Scholarship, as of this telling, has sent 51 young people through nursing school. 51. Dr. Evelyn Carter and Dorothy Mae Williams did catch up. They've had dinner twice in the last year. Dr. Carter says that Dorothy Mae is exactly the way she remembers her, generous, funny, and completely unimpressed by her own extraordinary life. James Webb told this story to his history class that fall. Not the celebrity version of history, the real kind. The kind made of ordinary people in ordinary moments who decide to be something other than silent. And Caleb Alexander Webb, 9.5 years old, a gold candy wrapper pressed flat in a red spiral notebook, 2 words written in pencil on the next page. He grew up. He's still growing up. And I believe, the way you believe things you can't prove but know in your chest, that he'll keep standing up. Because his father's 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 father lived in a country that tried very hard to keep people who looked like him seated. In every generation, something gets passed down. Something that says, not today, not in front of me, not to her. Stand up. That's the story. That's Dorothy Mae Williams. That's Caleb Webb. That's what happened at 30,000 feet over the American Southwest on a Tuesday morning in October of 2019. Now you carry it. Final call to action. If this story moved you, subscribe to Andrew's Black Stories right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment. Let's build something together. These stories matter. You matter. We'll see you in the next one. Final engagement question. What part of this story hit you the hardest? Dorothy Mae's grace? Caleb standing up? James Webb letting his son do it? The captain on the intercom? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. She reached out and put her hand gently on the side of his face, the way grandmothers do. That particular gesture that has no name, but means everything. Never stop doing that, she said. The world needs people who stand up when no one expects them to. Don't you ever let that go. You hear me? Caleb nodded. His voice, for the first time in the whole story, was small. Yes, ma'am. Dorothy Mae smiled. The full smile, the one she hadn't used all flight. The one that must have lit up hospital rooms for 31 years. She looked at James Webb. You raise a good one, she said. James Webb pressed his lips together. He nodded. He's better than me most days, he said quietly. Dorothy Mae laughed, a warm, real laugh that surprised people nearby and made them smile without knowing why. She gave Caleb one last look, a look that meant something, that meant I see you and I will remember you. And then she turned and walked off that plane. She walked through the jetway and out into the terminal, and she kept walking, steady and unhurried, through the noise and the crowds and the bright California light coming through the airport windows. She had a son to get to, a youngest child who hadn't seen her in 8 months, probably waiting for her right outside baggage claim, probably too tall now, probably with that look on his face he always got when he was trying to play it cool, but couldn't quite manage it. She had things to do, people to love. Behind her, on that plane, Caleb Webb opened his red notebook to the page with the gold candy wrapper. He looked at it for a second. Then he picked up his pencil. He wrote, "Stand up." Just those 2 words. 2 words that, if you live by them, really live by them, not just say them, but feel them in your body and act on them, even when your father says stay in your seat and you stand up anyway, can change something. Not just a flight, something bigger. Because here is what I want you to carry when you leave this story. Brandon Caldwell was placed on administrative leave following the flight. He completed a mandatory sensitivity training program and, according to people who know him, spent a significant amount of time doing something that doesn't come naturally to most of us, genuinely reckoning with himself. Whether he became a better person is between him and the choices he makes every day. That's always how it works. The Williams Nursing Scholarship, as of this telling, has sent 51 young people through nursing school. 51. Dr. Evelyn Carter and Dorothy Mae Williams did catch up. They've had dinner twice in the last year. Dr. Carter says that Dorothy Mae is exactly the way she remembers her. Generous, funny, and completely unimpressed by her own extraordinary life. James Webb told this story to his history class that fall. Not the celebrity version of history, the real kind. The kind made of ordinary people in ordinary moments who decide to be something other than silent. And Caleb Alexander Webb, 9.5 years old, a gold candy wrapper pressed flat in a red spiral notebook, 2 words written in pencil on the next page. He grew up. He's still growing up. And I believe, the way you believe things you can't prove but know in your chest, that he'll keep standing up. Because his father's 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 father lived in a country that tried very hard to keep people who looked like him seated. In every generation, something gets passed down. Something that says, not today, not in front of me, not to her. Stand up. That's the story. That's Dorothy Mae Williams. That's Caleb Webb. That's what happened at 30,000 feet over the American Southwest on a Tuesday morning in October of 2019. Now you carry it. Final call to action. If this story moved you, subscribe to Andrew's Black Stories right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment. Let's build something together. These stories matter. You matter. We'll see you in the next one. Final engagement question. What part of this story hit you the hardest? Dorothy Mae's grace? Caleb standing up? James Webb letting his son do it? The captain on the intercom? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one.